So behind me is the Atlantis Magnonx nuclear reactor. It was designed in the 60s, built in the 60s, took about 5 years to build, ran for 25 years, and in 1999 they started decommissioning it. And the first thing was to remove the fuel rods, but still inside, in these two huge Soviet-looking reactors, there's a core of graphite and steel, and that will remain radioactive for thousands and thousands of years. What are we going to do with it? Well, we don't really know. But my point is, if time just came and went, if we did have another glaciation, and this wasn't bulldozed away by an ice sheet, this would remain radioactive for thousands of years. Over about 10,000 years, pretty well all the concrete and all the steel will just be a rubble, just be a pyramid. So how would you warn the future? 10,000 years and beyond, when this is just a pile of rubble, not to dig into it. Here, the old graphite core would only be a risk thousands of years from now if descendants dug down into the ruins and perhaps burnt the graphite as fuel. Other plants, especially abandoned ones where the fuel is left in place, or waste dumps, would be more of a threat even thousands of years from now. If human civilization vanished tomorrow, these structures might stand for a few millennia. If civilization one day recovered, would they have a faint myth of godlike people who could speak to each other across the world through handheld devices, yet were also capable of their own destruction? Where would they look for evidence of us? What clues would we have left behind? Imagine a lost civilization 12,000 years ago and advanced enough to foresee its own collapse. It would have faced the same questions we do now. How would they have acted? What would they have done to preserve their knowledge? If you were part of that civilization, would you focus on rebuilding, ensuring the future recovery of society, or would you leave behind a warning, hoping someone someday would understand? I'm on a journey to discover a rational Atlantis, to explore mysteries and storytelling, but ultimately it's a tale that leads us to the darkest times in human history. My destination today is the Ardnamurchan Peninsula, a beautiful but forgotten corner of the Scottish Western Highlands. And the reason for this visit is to explore a strange feature in the landscape. My personal journey regarding Atlantis has evolved over the years. As a teenager, I was captivated by the enchantment of ancient mysteries. I remember when another kid at school brought in a copy of Chariots of the Gods, sparking wonder at the idea that aliens might have influenced humanity's past and shaped global mysteries. I was also a fan of Battlestar Galactica. It was thrilling to imagine lost knowledge and extraordinary civilizations hidden beneath the surface of history. But as I've matured and expanded my understanding of history and archaeology, I've come to appreciate the scientific consensus. Yet, this has not dimmed my sense of wonder. Rather, it has shown me how scientific exploration can deepen our appreciation for mysteries that remain. And the world remains rich with mysteries. And the past holds stories as fascinating and as complex as any speculative myth. So in this episode, I aim to explore Atlantis not through debunking or confrontation, but with empathy for those drawn to the unknown. Curiosity is a powerful force, capable of bridging wonder and understanding. I believe it's possible to seek truth while honouring the desire for awe and mystery. Whilst I cannot prove or demonstrate the existence of a long-lost advanced civilization predating the end of the last glaciation, I can share evidence of an extraordinary human past, one where the end of the Ice Age set the stage for the rise of civilization. And I'm going to explore a speculative Atlantis, a time of upheaval and collapse that still invites profound questions. The human experience is one of reconciling the rational with the wondrous. In this video, I invite you to join me on this journey where scientific exploration and mystery can coexist, and each deepening our understanding of the other. Thousands of miles south, in the Mauritanian Sahara, lies the Reichert structure. It's a 40-kilometre wide geological formation with clear concentric rings. First explored by Europeans in the 1930s, but it wasn't until Google Maps that it was proposed as a potential site for Atlantis.
Let me ask you this, Joe, real quick. When you saw my video, was that the very first time you had ever seen this thing before?
Yeah.
That's the thing.
And that is the thing, because if nothing else...
Superficially, its concentric walls resemble the Atlantis described by Plato 2,300 years ago. So my budget doesn't extend to a trip down to the Sahara, but I can come up here to Scotland to the Ardnamurchan Peninsula, where there's a similar geological feature. Ardnamurchan is clearly visible on satellite images, and up close, its ancient concentric walls, though eroded, are unmistakable. But what are we looking at? Nearby, ancient tombs and Bronze Age sites show human occupation dating back 8,000 years. Further south on the coast, a vast monolithic wall with no joints appears to have been almost poured into place. But as intriguing as these features seem, they aren't man-made. They're volcanic and formed 50 million years ago. The concentric rings here are ring dikes, created when a collapsing volcano, caldera, allowed magma to surge up in bands of hard and soft rock. The wall is a volcanic dike, a crack that filled with lava, later eroded to leave this striking feature. Likewise, the Reichert structure, the Eye of the Sahara, isn't artificial. Unlike Ardnamurchan, it wasn't a volcano, but magma still played a role. It's an eroded geological dome where uplifted sedimentary layers bore away to form concentric rings. Similar domes exist in Germany, Brittany and Harlech Wales, although less visible. Here on Arran, an ancient harbour stretches out into the sea. Again, entirely natural. Lava dikes formed where magma forced through cracks, just like Ireland's Giant's Causeway. That formation inspired the myth of Finn McCool. Originally, Finn was a Celtic outlaw hero, a Robin Hood, but to fit the story, he had to become a giant, one capable of building a giant stone causeway to Scotland, where he fought a Scottish giant who, after losing to Finn, tore up the causeway in rage. The legends fill in a gap in understanding. Then as now, people needed a story to explain the landscape, and they didn't have the benefit of science and geology. And this is entirely human. In fact, the love of a good mystery and finding the solution is hardwired into who we are, to the point we don't feel comfortable if there's a gap in our knowledge. Filling that gap, even with a story, gives our brains a little hit. Pattern recognition is also in our evolutionary toolbox. Seeing faces in clouds, or the human hand in natural formations is instinctive, useful for survival, for hunting, even poker, but it also fuels our love of a mystery. This image from Mars shows craters, valleys, and ridges, but if I tell you this is a pyramid space, your brain fills in the gap. You can't unsee the square. Early observers saw canals, then a face, then pyramids. But as more images arrived, the illusions faded. These Neolithic tombs are orientated towards a massive granite egg perched on a hill. Clearly, it was significant. But we can only guess why. Did they see it as a great cosmic egg, a sacred relic shaped by unknown hands, or a message left by an ancient people? Or did they understand nature, that the wind and time can create wonders? Interpreting the world around us isn't just natural, it's hardwired into us. It's how we navigate the unknown, how we make sense of a chaotic world. It's why we see a face in the moon, creatures in the clouds, or meaning in the random. And this instinct isn't a flaw, it's a strength. It fuels imagination, storytelling, and ultimately science. Recognizing pattern is what allows us to predict, to test, to understand. It's the first step towards knowledge. In 1769, Thomas Pennant, a wealthy naturalist with interest in zoology, geology, fossils, and local history, set off on horseback to explore Scotland, accompanied by his personal artist. The quality of his studies had already attracted the attention of other scientists, and he was welcomed into the Royal Society. His book, Tour of Scotland, published in 1771, was a bestseller, and it is here Glen Roy was brought to the attention of the public. And more importantly, the mystery of the parallel roads. And those 3 roads are clearly visible today, extending up the glen. So, what do you think they are? How were they formed? Now, Thomas speculated they were perhaps the work of Druids or Romans, and in some way connected with some fortress. Others had their ideas. At the time, early geologists were primarily split between catastrophists, who believed the landscape had been shaped by sudden events like floods, and Neptunism, who proposed that all rocks precipitated from some great primordial ocean, aligning with the biblical flood tradition but without requiring a global catastrophe. Perhaps these roads were the shoreline of a great flood that slowly receded, and the mystery continued with suggestions of lost civilizations. But more importantly, it stimulated the scientific interest in the Ice Age. The Ice Age and its end is of interest to those seeking a lost civilization because, according to Plato's Atlantis, it was sunk or flooded 10,000 years BC, 12,000 years ago, which just so happens to coincide with how we define the end of the last glaciation. But what makes this even more intriguing is that a scientific date for the end of the Ice Age came about slowly over the last 200 years, with deep-sea sedimentary samples in the 60s and 70s pinpointing that date. Prior to the 1830s, the notion of a great ice sheet covering Europe and North America was dismissed as fantastic. The idea of an ice age started to emerge in the late 18th and early 19th century, when primarily Swiss geologists noticed erratics, or strangers, rocks that didn't belong where found much further away from glaciers. These are the Norber erratics in Yorkshire, and they sit on limestone. The parent rock is from 10 miles away, with an intervening valley. So how did they get dumped on top of these hills when there are no glaciers in Britain? These mysteries proved irresistible to a young Swiss biologist who was expert in fish fossils and who completely changed direction in life and became a glaciologist. Actually, he became the first. Louis Agassiz travelled Europe and North America looking for evidence of an ice age, and his travels brought him here to Glen Roy. As it happened, another famous scientist, Charles Darwin no less, also visited 2 years earlier. During his visit to Glen Roy in 1838, Darwin was influenced by the prevailing geological theories of the time. He suggested the parallel roads were ancient shorelines of a lake that had been formed as land rose in stages, leaving behind distinct horizontal lines. And Scottish islands display examples of these raised beaches, where the land has been uplifted. However, Darwin's theory was later challenged and ultimately proven incorrect. Louis Agassiz, who visited Glen Roy in 1840, argued that the features were a result of glacial activity, specifically a glacial lake dammed by ice. Whilst Agassiz's initial explanation was also incomplete, he was closer to the truth than Darwin. The correct interpretation, which has emerged later, was that the parallel roads were indeed shorelines of a glacial lake, but the lake was formed by a natural dam, and certainly the glacier in Spleen Glen had a role, but was probably a combination of glacial debris, but not ice alone. Charles Darwin eventually acknowledged that his theory was mistaken, and he accepted the glacial explanation. And it's an episode that is often cited as an example of how great scientists like Darwin can make errors, but also how scientific understanding evolves through debate and evidence. The lake formed as the ice cap in Scotland melted and retreated. The top shoreline, or road, forming 15,000 years ago and lasting for about 1,000 years. As the ice retreated, then glacial debris dam gave way and a new lake formed, and that lasted another 1,000 years, which in turn, as the ice retreated, allowed for the final lake to form. Judging by the erosion, the emptying of these lakes, and others, as the ice receded, was not catastrophic. These were not great flood events, but nonetheless, the power of meltwater was great, carving up a landscape that had been carved up by 100,000 years of glacial action. Corrie Charlotte Gorge is a fabulous example of the power of melting ice, the water finding a small crack to wash out the softer surrounding rock at the end of the last glaciation. I brought you here to this post-glacial landscape to explore a central theme of lost civilization theory, principally that the collapse of an ice dam holding back Lake Agassiz, yes, named after Louis, and possibly caused by a comet impact, led to a huge flood event felt around the world, leading to the catastrophic end of a now lost civilization. Now, I think it's important to appreciate how we came to understand the end of the last ice age, how we know about the Younger Dryas event that plunged the world into a short cooling phase, and the impact of rising sea levels, given it is central to modern interpretations of Atlantis and lost civilizations. Now, Louis Agassiz was a maverick. He challenged the scientific establishment, and despite having no formal training in glaciology, essentially inventing the field, but that said, he was far from an enlightened figure. He clung to creationist beliefs, rejected Darwin's theory of evolution beyond minor variations, and was quite literally a white supremacist. By the 1970s, deep-sea sedimentary cores confirmed the date of 11,700 years ago for the start of the Holocene, or the end of the Ice Age. More recent research has revealed that that transition wasn't smooth. Climate could shift violently, as seen in the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near glacial conditions right before the Holocene began. Flood myths are a recurring theme in human cultures across the ages. Here in Wales, on Cardigan Bay, an ancient sunken forest occasionally emerges after winter storms shift the sand, and this submerged land is tied to a local myth, a kingdom drowned in a single night when a drunken gatekeeper failed to close the gates, allowing the sea to rush in. Now, there's another version, and it tells of a water nymph who gushed forth from a well, flooding the land. Unlike many flood myths, there's no ark, no saving of animals, no wrathful gods. Instead, it's a tale of human error and natural forces. This ancient woodland, where traces of human habitation, such as cooking fires and even footprints have been found, was drowned by an encroaching sea around 4,000 years ago. This event marked the end of a 15,000-year period of rapid sea level rise, which began 20,000 years ago when Earth emerged from its 100,000-year frozen slumber. Igneous Donnelly struck a chord with his 1882 book Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, and before Donnelly, Plato's Atlantis was often mentioned in passing or used metaphorically. For example, Francis Bacon's 1627 work, The New Atlantis, used the idea as a framework for his ideal society. Spanish historian López de Gomara speculated in the 16th century the Americas might be the remnants of Atlantis, and he blended classical texts with the discovery of the New World. And Atlantis was even included on a map in 1665. However, most scholars, including Voltaire, during the Enlightenment, viewed Plato's story as allegorical, mocking those who took it as historical fact. Now, Donnelly, writing in the 1880s, linked Atlantis to the growing scientific understanding of the end of the last ice age. He also capitalized on the fascination with comets, which had long been the subject of speculation, from the doom-laden omens in ancient times to the mix of science and superstition sparked by the close approach of the comet in 1811. Donnelly was the first to suggest that a comet caused a flood that sank Atlantis. He diverged from Plato in key ways. He claimed Atlantis was a vast continent rather than an island, and he argued it was the cradle of human civilization, and asserted that all flood myths derived from its destruction. And it was Edgar Cayce, the American spiritualist, who later expanded the story, claiming the Atlanteans were advanced beings with aircraft, an unknown power source, and even mind control. Yet even Plato's account seems uncanny in its timing, as he placed the destruction of Atlantis around 11,600 years ago, remarkably close to the scientific date of the end of the last ice age. But what does science mean when it dates the end of the last glaciation to 11,700 years ago? To put it in human terms, think of 18 as the age when a child becomes an adult. The process begins much earlier, puberty starting around 12 or later, and full maturity isn't reached until the mid-20s. Some people don't even stop growing at 18. Similarly, the end of the Ice Age wasn't a single event, but a process that unfolded over thousands of years. Warming began around 20,000 years ago, after the coldest phase of the 100,000-year glaciation. And it took about 8,000 years for glaciers to retreat and the sea level to rise. At the height of the Ice Age, sea levels were 120 meters lower than today. Now, rapid sea level rise occurred in several phases, with a major period around 14,500 years ago, when sea levels rose by 20 meters over 700 years. In geological terms, rapid means about 3 centimeters per year. Hardly a catastrophic flood by human standards. Even the inhabitants of Doggerland, a now submerged landmass in the North Sea, it had thousands of years to adapt. Their island wasn't fully submerged until 7,000 years ago. As the sunken forest here shows, submerged just 4,000 years ago, the glaciers continue to melt for millennia after the end of the last ice age. Humans are drawn to dramatic events, part of our storytelling nature. We evolve to respond to immediate threats and dramatic changes, which is why we often overlook gradual, generational, or geological shifts. Flood myths, whether tied to Atlantis or local legends, reflect the preference for sudden, catastrophic explanations over the slow forces that shape our world. So what about the Younger Dryas? A sudden cooling and rapid sea level rise that modern lost civilization hunters often spotlight. This brief, abrupt event ended around 11,700 years ago, marking the start of the modern warm era. The rapid cooling is thought to have been caused by a change in ocean circulation when a massive ice dam broke, releasing vast amounts of cold fresh water into the Atlantic and plunging northwest Europe back into near glacial conditions. But was this flood catastrophic? Well, not globally. In North America, the collapse of the ice dams led to sudden dramatic flooding, as seen in the Scablands. But worldwide, sea levels rose only a few centimeters over centuries. Locally, in northwest Europe, the cooling would have been noticeable within a generation, enough for hunters to shift south, but not dramatic enough to inspire a legendary flood myth. As for the cause of that massive freshwater release, some have speculated a comet might have been involved, but ultimately the ice and the glacial debris dam was doomed. Scientists have long sought fingerprints of such catastrophic events, despite hints from a crater in Greenland that impact turned out to be too early to have been responsible. All of this leads us to a bigger question. Why did Homo sapiens, existing for around 300,000 years, only manage to get our act together in the last 10,000? Here in Harrisburg in Norfolk, there is rapid change. The land is falling into the sea. It's not helped by current climate change, but the reason is geological. Britain is tilting up in the west and tilting down in the east. In 2013, an extraordinary discovery was made. Footprints in the sand dating from 800,000 years ago, complete with children's prints, stone tools and bones. These are the oldest human footprints found outside of Africa and left by Homo antecessor, a distant cousin of modern humans. The hunting grounds were once along the North Sea. Since these footprints were made, there have been roughly 7 interglacial periods. Modern humans have existed in only 2. So why did our ancestors not evolve civilization during the warm period, known as the Humane, around 130,000 years ago to 115,000 years ago? Well, first, the Humane was shorter than our interglacial, and despite being much warmer, enough for hippos to frolic in the Thames, and for sea levels to be much higher, it left no trace of an advanced society. If civilization had blossomed then, even up to kind of Victorian levels, we would expect to see evidence: mining scars, elevated CO2 from fossil fuel burning, or even radioactive fingerprints from an atomic age. Instead, what we find are abundant, indestructible hand axes, relics of a time when our ancestors were still learning to survive. Now, there's 2 key reasons why early humans didn't build a civilization in that interglacial. The first is climate. The Humane, though warm, was hectic and fairly brief, unsuitable for sustained agriculture. But also, human populations were very, very low, and our ancestors were still discovering our potential. Now, when the glaciers returned, it wasn't sudden, an apocalyptic event. Rather, cooling was gradual, and it took around 70,000 years for the glaciers to reach their maximum extent. This slow progress meant that although ecosystems contracted into tiny refuges, these are ecological arcs, and while the tundra and steppes expanded, conditions never stabilized long enough for civilization to take hold. The most fascinating fact, at least for me, is that all the species of animal and plants on Earth, and a lot more besides, that are not around today, slowly contracted to tiny little niches. The rainforests around the world retreated to an area far smaller than today, but with a myriad of species bottled up in these refuges, these arcs. European woodlands and every other ecosystem of the tropics and the temperate zones did the same, ecological arcs. The icy tundra and cold steppe, as well as deserts, expanded. The planet with so much water locked up in the poles became drier and colder. The steppe became the most dominant ecosystem. And it delights me no end that common shrubs and trees like the blackthorn and hawthorn evolved in these cooler, drier environments with sharp thorns to ward off grazing woolly rhinos. Common drought-resistant imports like cotoneaster and pyrocanthus that come from Asia likewise evolved to fend off megabeasts and mammoth. And mammoth food included common grasses and buttercups. Now, the Neanderthals exploited these ecosystems, and modern humans, arriving from the Middle East 50 to 40,000 years ago, could only move into Europe after inventing better hunting tools, clothing, and communication to coordinate in the hunting of megabeasts. Our brain evolution and cultural development continued for another 20,000 years during the deepest chill of the last glaciation. Cave art, Venus figurines, intricate carvings, jewellery, flutes, and ritual burials emerged. We domesticated the dog, designed improved tools, tailored our clothing, and yet, despite these impressive leaps, agriculture was not invented until much later. So why didn't we invent agriculture? That remains the burning question, a puzzle at the intersection of climate, human evolution, and the chance that a lost civilization might have once flourished under very different conditions. 20,000 years ago, humans were reaching their intellectual potential. But there were good reasons why we didn't invent agriculture. The most relevant was climate. the planet was not only colder, but also drier. The foundation of our civilization, grasses such as wheat, barley, rice and maize, had wild ancestors that thrived in specific ecological niches, wedged between the expanding deserts to the south and the steppe to the north. In such dry, cool conditions, these cereal plants didn't spread widely, nor were they abundant enough to be a reliable food source, and their nutritional value likely wasn't worth the effort of harvesting. Now, all of that changed with warming. As the ice sheets melted, they released vast amounts of fresh water, whilst the oceans gave up their dissolved CO2, pushing atmospheric concentrations from 180 parts per million to 280 parts per million, and rising global temperatures of 5 degrees C. The surge in warmth and moisture transformed the world. The Sahara, once a desert, became a grassland, rainforests and temperate woodlands expanded, and previously barren savannas and tundra steppe regions burst into life. Forests conquered the land, and I suspect the demise of megafauna was as much due to this expansion of woodlands as it was to human hunting. Humans too were now in a position to take advantage of the changing world. Their populations had grown, and the wild ancestors of domesticated plants and animals, grasses that would become cereals, along with cattle, pigs and sheep, had evolved in the same ecological niche between the great tundra steppe and the southern deserts. As the climate warmed, this niche expanded, creating an environment that hunter-gatherers could exploit more intensely. By the time the first farmers arrived here in Brittany 4,000 years later, their descendants had undergone a slow but massive migration across the continent, bringing agriculture with them. With each generation, they transformed the land, domesticating plants and animals, and eventually reaching the point of building these massive megalithic constructions. Elsewhere, they were already building towns and even cities. Now, sometime between 20,000 and 40,000 years ago, the human mind became ready to move beyond hunter-gatherer and embrace town planning, governance, and long-term settlement. All it needed was the right opportunity. I would love for a lost civilization to be discovered deep in the Amazon or hidden among the islands of Indonesia. These regions, with their dense forests and shifting landscapes, could still conceal secrets from that deep past, but there certainly won't be traces in the Sahara. During the last glaciation, it was not only larger, but it was also drier than today, making it an inhospitable place for any civilization to thrive. If archaeologists were to uncover a civilization that predates the Neolithic, they would of course be ecstatic. Such a discovery would pose fascinating and difficult questions. How did they develop agriculture in a world gripped in an ice age? How did they sustain and grow a population large enough to drive technological advancements? Every civilization we currently understand has been rooted in the ability to produce surplus food, allowing for specializations, trade, and the accumulation of knowledge. A lost civilization arising in the depths of prehistory would challenge our entire framework of how complex societies emerge. These are the questions that anyone interested in lost civilizations must tackle. Here in Brittany, I am surrounded by ancient monuments whose meanings have been lost to time. Yet, while we may not fully understand their rituals, governance, or language, we do know how these people lived. We can trace the domestication and breeding of their animals, the cultivation of their plants, and the technologies they used. Even though the builders of these megaliths are in some ways a true lost civilization, they left behind an abundance of fingerprints, pollen records, tool remnants, decorative art, and imprints of their daily lives. That's precisely what's missing in claims of a lost advanced civilization: tangible evidence. A society capable of developing complex agriculture, large-scale architecture, and advanced technologies would have left unmistakable traces. Now, until those traces emerge, the search remains a compelling mystery, but one that must be approached with the same rigorous scrutiny we apply to known history. Now, the academic consensus is, while there's still much to learn about the past, the broad strokes of how civilization emerged are well understood. So I have to ask, and this is going back to our hardwired need to explain things, what gap does the idea of a lost advanced civilization, one that supposedly travelled the world, educated hunter-gatherers in agriculture and construction, actually fill? In the ancient world, people faced gaps in knowledge, and being human, when they couldn't ascertain facts, they simply made things up. An example being Giant's Causeway. Lacking an understanding of geology, they didn't just accept the strange rock formations, they created a story. People not turning off their car alarms. Greeks in Plato's time, despite being skilled seafarers, really didn't know what was going on to the far north and beyond the Pillars of Hercules and the Atlantic Ocean. And they really wanted to know. Figures like Hecataeus and Herodotus became immensely popular by filling in those blanks, rationalizing myths and weaving history out of speculation. But long before them, Homer's work had already painted vivid pictures of distant and mysterious lands, setting a precedent for generations of storytellers. Travellers' tales were a hot commodity in the ancient Mediterranean, and I'm sure many a sailor was more than happy to embellish their adventures in exchange for wine and attention. Over time, it all got a little out of hand. Writers looking for a bestseller simply invented entire civilizations. Lucian famously mocked the trend with A True Story, a satire on wild travellers' tales that also happened to be the first work of science fiction featuring a trip to the moon and the sun. So where did Plato get the story of Atlantis? Was it based on a real event, distorted over time, a misinterpretation of history, or was it simply another traveller's tale, exaggerated for a dramatic effect? Now, Plato's description of Atlantis is highly stylized and symbolic, emphasizing order, symmetry, and harmony. The concentric rings and perfect geometry of the city reflect an idealized version of utopia, while the fertile plain and protective mountains suggest abundance and security. The central island, elevated and separate, symbolizes the sacred and the royal core of civilization. The entire geography is designed to invoke awe and convey the grandeur of Atlantis before its fall. Herodotus, often called the father of history, was happy to include one-eyed cyclopses and gold-obsessed griffins in his supposedly factual accounts. The grain of truth, though, is the possibility that the skulls of an extinct elephant were mistaken for remains of one-eyed giants. Similarly, Plato's Atlantis might have been inspired by a real place, distorted by time and imagination. Plato locates Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules and describes the island as having a central plain of an oblong shape measuring approximately 345 miles in length and 230 miles in width. Mountains lay to the north, and a central channel connects the southern and northern regions of this seafaring nation. The central city with the circular channels is less clearly located. It could be in the middle of the island or to the far north where the central channel or canal supposedly terminates. So what island of that size exists in the Atlantic? Britain is roughly 550 miles long and under 300 miles wide. Close enough fit to Plato's description. Now here in Orkney, there are some details of Atlantis' central city that seem aligned with the landscape here. Now, this is pure speculation. I can't prove that Plato heard a sailor's story about travelling into the Atlantic and encountering the islands of the north. But bear with me and see what you think. Sailors in Plato's time did travel beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic, trading tin with Britain. The Greek historian Herodotus mentioned the Tin Isles and believed to refer to Cornwall and nearby islands, indicating that the region was known as a source of tin in the classical world. Direct trade may have existed for hundreds of years before that, with indirect trade via intermediaries stretching back as far as 4,000 years ago. Perhaps sailors ventured north, either up the North Sea or the Irish Sea, searching for something even more valuable than gold. Amber, which we know mainly came from the Baltic. On their way, they would have encountered Celtic traders in their brocks in Orkney, and brocks are uniquely defensive structures found in northern Scotland, often located on the coast and highly visible, possibly serving as an advertisement for passing trade. 2,500 years ago, anyone visiting Orkney would have been confronted with the ruins of a great and mysterious civilization that had been abandoned some 700 years earlier. Great temples and tombs stood deserted, their purpose and builders long forgotten. Perhaps the local Celts had their ideas of the civilization that went before. They may have even carried oral traditions from that megalithic age. Plato describes channels around the central city of Atlantis, as well as a central channel leading to the heart of the city. He mentions two springs, one hot and one cold, a poetic touch perhaps. But in Orkney, the central temples and stone circles sit between a freshwater lake and a brackish one. And there's a channel to the sea. Plato describes the great temples of Atlantis as barbaric, lacking the refined stonework of Athens. In Orkney, the Mesa Brodka, a Neolithic complex covering over 6 hectares, features numerous buildings that appear to be temples and meeting places. Plato also mentions the lone mountain that was the birthplace of the first rulers of Atlantis, who gave birth to Cleto, married to Poseidon, the god of the sea. Their 5 sets of twins went on to form the 10 tribes of Atlantis. Curiously, the Nessa Brodka includes a great meeting place where the 10 tribes might have gathered to feast. Plato's description of the Temple of Poseidon, 300 meters in length, 100 meters in breadth, and of a height that appeared symmetrical, matches the grandeur of the Orkney structures, though on a smaller scale. The largest structure on the Orkney Acropolis measures 25 by 20 meters, but its cobbled roof would have given a pyramidical shape predating any Egyptian pyramid by thousands of years. Plato also describes Atlantis as having a great wall made of red, white and black rock, with subterranean channels roofed in the same local stone. And Orkney has similar sea caves, although they don't penetrate to the inner sound. Still, to a passing visitor, it would be easy to imagine that they once led to the centre of the island. And there's plenty of these tunnels and channels. Plato's Atlantis is an idyllic place, complete with elephants, olive trees, and other Mediterranean fruits, as well as silver, gold, and orichalcum, a mysterious red metal worth its weight in gold. And some have speculated that it could refer to amber, which was exported to Greece from the Baltic and prized for its beauty and electrostatic properties. As I hopefully made clear, I've cherry-picked parts of the Atlantis story that fit my hypothesis, and ignored the details that don't. I'm being very human and gap-filling with my imagination, but the British Isles are the only islands beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic that come close to matching Plato's dimensions, and there's a historical fact that lends weight to the speculation. The Bronze Age culture of northwestern Europe, including Orkney, underwent significant changes 3,200 years ago. Stone circles, tombs, and presumed temples fell into disuse, and the Bronze Age people later emerged as the iron-using Celts.
No? But you look so handsome.
Plato claims the war between the Atlanteans and the Mediterranean world of Greeks and the Egyptians occurred 11,600 years ago. Of course, there was no Egyptian or Greek civilization at that time. But what if the Egyptian claim, passed on to Solon, was loosely based on fact? What if there was a great temple wall that depicted a battle between Egyptians and Atlanteans, distorted by time and retelling? So, consider the mortuary temple of Ramesses III near Luxor. Close to the Valley of the Kings, Ramesses III was the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom, before Egypt descended into a dark age. The temple is fascinating, not only for its extensive reliefs carved into the walls, but also for its substantial mud brick defensive wall. Ramesses built this temple as a monument to ensure his legacy, but it also served as a pleasure palace and seemingly a refuge. Egypt at the time was besieged by neighbours, desert tribes, and importantly, mysterious sea peoples, a coalition of 10 tribes who appeared in the Mediterranean around 3,200 years ago. The temple's relief depicts Ramesses victorious over the Palset, one of the sea people contingents. He even incorporated captured Shurdan warriors into his personal bodyguard. The Egyptian priests reportedly told Solon that the great battle happened 9,000 years earlier. However, Egyptian dating systems were complex. Internal Egyptian chronology reset to zero with every new ruler's reign, and multiple rulers sometimes shared the throne simultaneously. By Solon's time, Egypt had been under Greek rule, and priests used a mixture of solar years and lunar years and pharaoh years. If we were to interpret the 9,000 suns, moons, or lunar cycles, it translates to roughly 727 years. Adding this to Solon's death around 560 BCE brings us appropriately to 1287 BCE, a date that aligns intriguingly with the Sea People's first appearance in Egyptian records during the reign of the Pharaoh Merenptah. Around me is a peat bog in Ireland. Peat grows at about 1 millimetre or 2 per year, and its damp, acidic conditions preserve organic material like moss, heather, and even trees. Oak trees that fell into these bogs centuries ago have been remarkably preserved. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, allows us to date these ancient oaks with precision. The Irish bog oak dataset stretches back 7,500 years, with other datasets reaching 12,000 years. These records reveal a 20-year winter from 1159 to 1139 BCE, a period of catastrophic climate change. Now, Plato's rounded figure of 9,000 suns or moons rather, places this event over a century later. But remember, Plato was crafting an elegant narrative. Exact numbers like 6,850 moons or years lacks the poetic appeal of 9,000 years. There's some flexibility in Egyptian pharaoh dates, as records, though extensive, can be slightly contradictory or incomplete. This period, roughly 1,250 years BCE to 1,150 years BCE, was devastating for civilizations across the Mediterranean and beyond, known as the Bronze Age collapse. It saw the declines of the Mycenaeans in Greece, the Hittites, the Egyptians, and the Canaanite states. Entire civilizations disappeared, and megalithic monuments like stone circles in Britain were abandoned. The collapse of these cultures could indeed coincide with the 20-year climate event recorded in the tree ring. Was the conflict in Egypt with the Sea People the Great War Plato alludes to in his story of Atlantis?
A city called Troy. But what happened here? What lies beneath the legend of the Trojan War?
Now consider Troy, the city-state attacked by the Greeks in Homer's Iliad, written around 800 years BC, but set in this earlier period. Troy was destroyed around 1,180 years BC, and the Iliad describes a 20-year war sparked by the abduction of Helen. Yet after the siege, Helen returns to Greece and administers a potion of forgetfulness, earning forgiveness despite the bloodshed. Could Helen, the daughter of Zeus and the most beautiful woman in the world, be a distant memory of the fertility goddess who abandoned Greece for 20 years, only to be welcomed back on her return? The Sea Peoples, referred to by the Egyptians as the peoples of the Great Green, remains a mystery. 10 tribes are recorded, including the Libyans, Sheridan, Pelsat, and others. Most are presumed to be seafaring tribes from around the Mediterranean. But could Bronze Age Britons and other northwestern Europeans have been among them? Climate change certainly impacted Europe and the Middle East, potentially displacing northern peoples and triggering a domino effect of migration and conflict. The cause of the 20-year winter is debated. Volcanic eruptions, like Tambora in 1815, have caused years without summer, but a 20-year winter would require extraordinary volcanic activity. Now, another possibility is extraterrestrial. Comets. Homer's Iliad begins with Apollo casting fiery arrows at the Greeks, and fireballs are associated with comet debris. The Trojan horse, which breached Troy's defences, might even symbolize a comet, as the Greeks associated comets with horses due to their long flowing tails. Comet imagery also appears in another migration myth of the period, the Exodus. Pharaoh Menptah, often identified as the evil pharaoh of Exodus, ruled during the first recorded mention of the Sea People and the Israelites. The Exodus story describes extreme climate change, plagues, and divine guidance in the form of a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Could this be a borrowing of Philistine myth about their own migration? A possible culprit is Comet Encke, a close proximity comet that still orbits the Sun every 3 years. It's a possible candidate for the Turin meteor stream. This stream includes large space rocks capable of significant impacts, and its presence in the night sky might have been associated with Earth's passage through a dust cloud, leading to fireballs, shooting stars, and atmospheric dust loading. It's amusing to note the word disaster comes from the Greek for bad star. A cosmic disaster causing the collapse of civilization adds a dramatic twist to the story. A great white god who is both the warning and the salvation, and the smiter of enemies. It's the narrative that resonates across cultures and time, blending myth, history, and the eternal human fascination with the stars. So that is my very rational Atlantis, a mythical memory of catastrophic climate change, reinterpreted and repurposed throughout history. And there's plenty of mystery here, and many questions we may never answer. And yes, there are weak links and a huge amount of speculation. Plato claims the Atlanteans invaded and waged war against the Greeks and Egyptians. I'm not suggesting the Sea People were from Orkney or the British Isles. Rather, I propose that a sailor's tale of a distant lost civilization, combined with the mythical memory of the Bronze Age collapse, and actual Egyptian records of battles with mysterious sea peoples, or northerners as they were also known, was co-opted by Plato to make a philosophical point rather than record history. Plato likely used the story of Atlantis not as a historical account, but as a cautionary tale about the rise and fall of civilizations, weaving together myths, sailors' tales, and historic echoes to illustrate his philosophical ideas, and a warning of the dangers of hubris and the fragility of civilization, and an ideal state that could prevent such disaster. And it's curious that modern lost civilization hunters do the same. It's not enough to simply have a lost civilization, but to have one warning us of impending disaster. So in this offering of Rational Atlantis, I want to draw attention not only to the appeal of lost civilizations, but to the dangers of taking fantasy too far. The idea of Atlantis and similar myths has often been used to fill in gaps in our understanding of the past. Before archaeology became a rigorous science, These myths help to explain the origins of culture and civilization, but in the late 19th century in Germany, something more troubling emerged. A version of Atlantis shaped not by discovery but ideology, inspired in part by Tacitus' writings on the noble resistance of the ancient Germanic tribes against the Roman Empire. A myth of ethnic and spiritual purity took root. This wasn't just romantic nationalism, it was a radicalized vision of history that imagined ancient Germans as a pure people of the forest, untainted by decadence of the south. The Thule society, named after a mythical northern island mentioned in classical texts, offered a mystical origin story that survivors of the sunken Thule, a kind of northern Atlantis, settled in Germany, bring with them divine bloodlines, blonde, blue-eyed, and destined. This pseudo-history became a spiritual foundation for Nazi ideology. When the Nazis came to power, their obsession with the lost Aryan past drove them to search for evidence of it, no matter how slim or fabricated. Now, unlike parts of Western Europe, Germany lacks many visible Neolithic monuments, so the regime turned to places like Extenstein, a dramatic sandstone rock formation in the Teutoburg forest. These stones were shaped and modified over centuries by Christian hermits and pilgrims, but the Nazis reimagined them as a sacred historic site, a Wotan's throne, the pagan heart of an ancient Germania. Himmler's personal archaeological and occult research institute sent teams to investigate. They found no ancient lost civilization, so they were told to look harder, and when they found nothing, they embellished. Himmler's vision extended to Berg Wall 19, a crumbling castle that he intended to transform into a kind of spiritual headquarters of the SS. With forced labour and looted materials, he began to create a shrine to this imagined past, a Nazi Camelot, a temple of relics, mysticism and myth. The SS were to be the knights. Even their insignia, whose twin lightning bolts were drawn from the ancient ruins, part of the illusion of continuity with a legendary Germanic past. Of course, invoking a glorious lost age isn't unique to Nazi Germany. Many empires and ideologies look backward for validation, but the Nazis took this to extremes. They hunted for the pure survivors of Atlantis, not just through stories and artifacts, but through language and anatomy. Expeditions were sent to Iceland, Tibet, even the Andes, in search of the oldest untainted bloodlines. They studied skulls obsessively, murdering prisoners to acquire them, believing that the shape of the head could reveal racial purity or degeneration. This was the most chilling consequence of their fancies. Not just the rewriting of history, but the weaponization of pseudoscience in the service of genocide. And many academics went along with it. Those who didn't comply were sacked, silenced, or fled. But far too many chose to keep their jobs by bending truth to fit ideology. That may be one of the darkest outcomes of pursuing fantasy over evidence, the corruption of knowledge itself. So, no, having an interest in lost civilizations doesn't make you a racist or a Nazi. But we all need to be cautious about the stories we inherit and the sources we trust. Atlantis may be a myth, but how we use it still matters.
Is it just me, or are these paving cobbles a little inappropriate?
If you're drawn to the mysteries of the past, if you feel that thrill when you stand before an ancient monument and wonder who built this and why, then you already have something in common with real archaeologists. You love the past, you care about history, and you want answers. It's a good thing. That passion is what drives discovery. But here's the problem. A real story of our past is so much more interesting than the fairy tales peddled by those who twist evidence to fit a pre-made narrative. Truth isn't less exciting than the myth, it's bigger, more complex, and far more astonishing. And the best bit is you can be part of it. Not just as a spectator, but as a contributor. Citizen science is a real thing. Lost cities are being found in the jungle right now because of people analysing satellite data with their laptops. Metal detectorists, once shunned by archaeologists, are now helping to rewrite history. Drone owners can look for crop marks and the advent of cheap LiDAR, and drones have seen the discovery of lost civilizations in the rainforest. Every time someone records a find, takes a photo, shares a new observation to an online portal, they add to the vast puzzle of our past. But beyond direct contributions, inspiration itself is one of the greatest gifts non-scientists can offer to science. How many astronomers first dreamed of the stars because of Star Trek? How many paleontologists were captivated as kids watching Jurassic Park? It's the storytellers, the writers, the filmmakers, the artists who spark imagination, who dare to ask what if, and who, time and time again, have nudged science forward. Because where would science be without the storyteller? So, I do hope you've enjoyed this episode. Do comment, like, and subscribe.